Okay, we're back from our brief break. We've got 60 minutes for this really, from my subjective point of view, really exciting panel. I have a deep interest in Indonesia, so I'm very excited to be chairing this panel on Indonesia and understanding patterns of radicalization, particularly because it involves an old friend, Julie Chernov Hwang. We've only got 60 minutes, so I won't speak for long. We'll have our two 20-minute presentations and then 20 minutes of Q&A. Then you've got a long lunch break, which you deserve. This is day 3 of a long webinar, so you deserve that long lunch break, much as I'd like to stretch the discussion out. So Julie Chernov Hwang is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Goucher College in Baltimore. And she's been working on this topic of radicalization into violent extremism in Indonesia for a long time. But before that, she wrote Peaceful Islamist Mobilization in the Muslim World, What Went Right? That was back in 2009. And then co-edited Islamist Parties and Political Normalization in the Muslim World in 2014. And then several years ago, her really important book, The Disengagement of Indonesian Jihadists, was published in 2018 with Cornell University Press. And she's currently working on a new book, Becoming Jihadis, Radicalization and Commitment in Southeast Asia. And that explores why Indonesian and Filipino Muslims join and why they take on high-risk roles. So really interesting picking up what Bart and Sarah were discussing in the previous panel. And then I'll introduce Mukhamat Surya in a minute from the Indonesian police, looking at his PhD work on pathways into radicalization. But first to you, Julie. This is really great to have you joining us. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg. And selamat datang kepada Mukhamat, and good morning, Australia. It's a pleasure to get the opportunity to present what will probably be, just in the interest of time, the first chapter of my new book project, Becoming Jihadis, which I just received notice has been contracted with Oxford University Press. So that was some very wonderful things to hear. Is it possible to get my slides up?
One moment.
Thank you. So while we're doing that, as I said, just in the interest of time, next slide. So today I'm going to be largely focusing on the first question in the interest of time. And if we have any time, I'll address the second question. I can address the second in Q&A. But what I really want to talk about today is why individuals join Islamist extremist groups, looking at Indonesia, looking at Philippines. And if there is time, I'll also address the 5 pathways and 1 partial pathway via which Indonesians join Islamist extremist groups. So between 2010 and 2019, if I can have the next slide, this has been what I've been working on. I've been looking at terrorist behavior, joining, disengagement. First, it was disengagement, de-radicalization, and reintegration, and then realizing that I had this wonderful data set of what was at that time 55 interviews with 55 individuals. I received a grant from Smith Richardson to write the prequel to Why Terrorists Quit, the Disengagement of Indonesian Jihadists. And I was able to do 150 interviews with 97 current and former and inactive members of 14 Indonesian Islamist extremist groups in 14 cities. And what I sought to look at when I started this project was looking at the process of joining to commitment, and from commitment to role assignment. And just in the interest of time today, I'm just going to, as I said, speak to motivations. In addition to the interviews that I did, I also compiled 13 dossiers with compiled from primary source documents on Indonesians, current and former members of ISIS-affiliated groups, and then sought to expand that to the Philippines. And in 2019, I interviewed 25 members of the Mount group, one member of the Abu Sayyaf group as well. And my sample between 2010 and 2019, while I was doing these interviews, I kept going back and back again to do repeat interviews with many of the same people. My sample is skewed male because if you want to interview the wives of extremists, you have to first get the consent of the husbands and the brothers and the fathers. And so it took time to build that relationship. So at present, I've interviewed 91 men and 6 women. I conducted the interviews on Indonesia, on Java, Sumatra, and Sulawesi. In the Philippines, the interviews were done. Can I have next slide? So in Indonesia, my interviews were done in Poso and Central Sulawesi. So over here, as well as the cities of Palu and Ampana, I interviewed all over Java, and in Pekanbaru on the island of Sumatra. In the Philippines, next slide, please. I interviewed in Marawi and did one interview in Manila, and interviewed in Marawi, the district of Piagapo, which abuts Marawi, and Butik, where the Maut family was based. Now, I can't emphasize this enough, and some of the predecessors who were speaking tonight were speaking about how difficult it is to do these interviews. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to interview whenever possible and to do repeat interviews, because when you do repeat interviews, you can ask follow-up questions, you can seek clarification, you can take the conversation in new routes that you didn't foresee before. If somebody says something and you find data that indicates that that may not be accurate, you can go back to them. And over time, as you're doing this, you build trust with the interviewee, and they open up and they begin sharing their personal narrative more completely with greater color and measure than in that one-off interview when you parachuted in. And there've been people that I've been interviewing on and meeting for 9 years on just about every visit, and I'm still learning new things. And if we want to think about it, I've said this a couple of times when people say to me, well, you know, do people, well, of course they lie to you. And what I say is, if you were being interviewed, I mean, maybe this is not true for Greg, who I think likes being interviewed, but if you're an introvert like me and you're being interviewed, you might not lie, but you're going to obfuscate and you're going to leave things out. And that's the benefit of doing repeat interviews. So you go back again, and you go back again, and you go back again. And people supplement and they bring things in. And all of a sudden, over time, you get a fuller picture. And that is so critical to our work, working in studying at the individual level about why people join, why they engage in high-risk activism, why they commit, why they disengage, why they reintegrate. I can't emphasize this enough. I'm a huge proponent of conducting repeat interviews because it really enables you to have at least some measure of confidence in the work that you're doing. Next slide, please. So I'm going to make the argument to you today, and it's perhaps not a surprising argument, that while many factors might motivate a person to join an Islamic extremist group. What makes a person stay in the group, commit, engage in high-risk activism? It's first and foremost social. Becoming a member of an extremist group is a social experience. You're joining a community of people who share beliefs and norms and values and goals and a deep familial commitment to one another. And so what I am going to show you, speak today about primarily, is that piece about why people join. And what I found in my interviews was that people join an extremist group based on the interaction of two sets of factors. First, who they know, and second, what they seek. The people who joined extremist groups tended overwhelmingly to have family, teachers, or friends in the group. What they sought, but having family, friends, mentors in the group was necessary because it gave them an entry point. And this is especially true for Indonesia, but that in itself was rarely sufficient. Joining also had to fulfill a need. So if we look at the factors, seeking knowledge about Islam and jihad, seeking altruistic motives, seeking to improve lives of Muslims, seeking revenge, seeking redemption, and far lower numbers for seeking the caliphate. Seeking knowledge about Islam and jihad referred to not just knowledge about Islam, like wanting to read the Quran. It was, in some cases, seeking pure Islam, seeking Salafi Islam. But most often it went in tandem with seeking practical understanding of jihad. Not simply theoretical knowledge on jihad, but practical knowledge on jihad. Seeking to improve the lives of Muslims was oftentimes altruistic motives. It might have been helping in a conflict zone and going from Java to a conflict area. It could also be simply trying to find ways to make Muslims' lives better. What was interesting was the revenge factor. Revenge, the 23 people who spoke about revenge came from a specific district, and that was the district of Poso. And here they sought revenge for the 2001 Wali Songo massacre, where 100, mostly women and children, were slaughtered by Christian militiamen at a mosque and Islamic boarding school at Wali Songo. And there were several men I interviewed of those 23 who lost upwards of a dozen family members. And then there were more who saw decapitated bodies floating down the river for upwards of a week. And this imbued them with a sense of outrage and vengeful solidarity. Now, if we put that subgroup aside, then the key factors were seeking that practical knowledge of jihad, seeking to improve Muslim lives. So if we want to couch that in the language of Christian Picciolini, seeking purpose. Redemption was very interesting because redemption had a gendered component. Redemption could mean one of two things. Redemption for a life that was seen upon reflection as too simple, and redemption for family traumatized by divorce or departure of a parent. But redemption for men had a higher bar. There had to be a multidimensional crisis for men to talk about seeking redemption through joining an extremist group. So it wasn't just that they got a divorce. It was that their business went bankrupt and they got divorced and they lost the house and they lost the car and the pet died and like a bad country music song. And it was these multidimensional crises where they'd lost everything, their spouse, their job, their children, their home. This was something that was a seeking point for men who joined. So to recap, those who joined extremist groups had this interaction. They were motivated by the interaction between who they knew, knowing someone in the group that could provide an entry point, and that fulfilling a need. And most often, those needs were seeking knowledge, altruism, and if we put revenge aside for its regional specific component, seeking redemption. Next slide, please. I'll just briefly show Philippines as well. In the Philippines, you see the same confluence, who they know, what they seek. The most important was having family in the Mount group. And that family could be parents, it was most often uncles or relatives, cousins, in-laws, the extended family. And then what they seek in the Philippines, it was very different. And this has something to do with my sample. My sample only was 25 people. And my interviews were done in 3 areas: Marawi City itself, Boutique, which was the Mount Group home base, and the Mount family home base, and Piagapo, which was a rural district. And there was a lot of recruiting done in Piagapo around a mosque called the Tambo Mosque by the imam of that mosque, Imam Abilino de Macaling. Imam Abilino de Macaling recruited heavily from his extended family, but also from the practitioners at his mosque. And Piagapo is a desperately poor area. The main seeking factor that people reported was the financial incentives that went along with joining. Now, this runs counter to the findings of Sidney Jones, whose research on the Cotabato cell was of young, educated men, college-age men in a city. Some of mine were people who lived in Marawi City, but a good portion of mine didn't live in Marawi City. They lived in the rural areas and they were poorer. And so being able, when you have 7 or 8 mouths to feed in your family, and somebody is offering you more money than you could make in 2 years, that was a powerful motivator for my subgroup. And I don't know if that can be generalizable to all of the people who participated in the mock group. But the only people who didn't mention it as a factor were a college student or members of the Mount family. And I was fortunate to be able to interview several of them. The other factors that were important were in the Philippines were the opportunity to remedy injustice. The Mount insurgency happened. It was a legacy of a larger insurgency. And so as a result, their young people in the Philippines, in Marawi City, were spooned the Bangsamoro grievance narrative with their morning breakfast since they were children. So to remedy that injustice, especially for young people who came from families where parents and uncles had been members of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front that was now in talks with the government, this was their time to seek to remedy injustice. This was their time to do jihad. And they had also been schooled that that was something they wanted to do. Now, seeking knowledge about Islam here means something very different. It was lower numbers reporting it, and it was much different. These were young men in their teens who wanted to learn to read the Quran. That was all they wanted. And they started going to Quran study to learn to read Arabic and to learn to read the Quran. And some of them were members of the Mount family in their teens when this started, and 12, 13 when this started. Redemption here had the same bifurcation as Indonesia. For women, it was a lower bar. For men, it was multidimensional crises. They were dying. They found out their parents weren't their parents. There was trauma. They had a divorce, were alcohol addicted, were drug addicted. One of them was a hitman. All of these things caused them to say, I want to be a better person. But the bar had to be higher. So how am I doing on time, Greg?
We're just coming up to the end, if that's okay, Julie.
Okay, then in that case, I am going to stop there and turn the floor over to my counterpart, and I can speak more to pathways and to findings, to broader takeaways in the Q&A. But I'll stop here.
Excellent, wonderful presentation, and we'll come back to you on the pathways things. Congratulations on getting the country music bad song reference in, but you're right, it's that individual life story that's so important, and it is so important to speak to people, and people do like to tell their story, as you very well know. And that relates very much to what Mukhamat Surya has done with his PhD. Mukhamat is doing his PhD at the University of Queensland. He's just finishing up because in 2019 he got a Hadi Susastra Award from the Australian Embassy for his fieldwork, did his fieldwork, interviewed 34 detained and recently in some cases released Indonesian terrorists, and heard their life stories to try and understand what it is that took them in, how they got engaged. And as Julie has told us, there's so much nuance in the detail and the personal context, and that's why it's so important to speak to people. So great to have you following up on Julie's presentation, Mukhamat. We've still got you on mute, Mukhamat.
Yes. Okay. The title of the paper is Analyzing the Role of Online Behaviors and Engagements in the Radicalization of Indonesian Terrorists. And I am a PhD student. I'm in my third year of study under the supervision of Professor Adrian Cherney and Professor Winnifred. And basically, I am a psychologist, and I am a member of the Indonesian National Police. And my last position was the head of criminal psychology at the headquarters of Indonesian National Police in Jakarta. Okay. Well, this project is literally a part of a larger research project which main aims to identify the psychological pathways into and away from violent extremism. And the second aim is to examine whether the roles of individual plays in the terrorist groups influence in particular pathways into and away from violent extremism. And the third aim is to provide scientific suggestions for Indonesia's government in the work to counter terrorism, specifically in the design of the de-radicalization program in Indonesia. And early results will be presented in this paper. This is a qualitative method. This is a qualitative research, and life course analysis had been applied in this research through 62 in-depth interviews. And the total number of the sample is 53, includes the 34 terrorists, 7 agency officials, and 12 community experts or NGOs in Indonesia. And 34 participants interviewed from the 2 radicalized different groups. The first one is 14 captured terrorists. I interviewed them in the prisons, and 12 released violent extremists. And all of these participants were recommended by the 2 leading institutions in against terrorism in Indonesia. The first one is the BNPT, and the second one is Special Detachment 88. This is actually Hwang's story, Julie's story about the 4 pathways of Indonesian terrorists in joining any extremist group. Boarding school, Islamic study groups, conflict area, and kinship. However, from 14 captured terrorists that joined, that I interviewed in prisons, half of them joined into the extremist group through online, while the rest of them joined through offline, and mostly from the Islamic study groups. And the table shows the background of the 7 captured terrorist participants from the gender, age, family background, group, psychological factors, role played, pathway into radical group, educations, and length of the sentences. However, the background is various among them. I mean, we cannot state it that one particular background will join any or specific terrorist groups. But here we can see that all of the participants, they joined into 2 radical groups that allied with the ISIS. The JAD or Jamaah Ansar Daulah and MIT or Eastern Indonesian Mujahid in Poso, the both terrorist groups were allied with the ISIS in Syria. And this is the brief descriptions of 6 former terrorist participants. We can also see here that the backgrounds of the participants also varies among them. And still, we can see that they joined any terrorist group or extremist groups that allied with the ISIS, like JAD and also ISIS by itself. When 3 of them went to Syria to join the ISIS troops. And from these participants, we can manage us into 2 groups. The first one is participants who were exposed through online engagements and kept online. And the second group is participants that exposure through online engagements, but also attending any offline activities such as Islamic study group. And when we look at the disengagement processes for captured terrorists, they say that they have left the radical groups after the exposure of the moderate religious resources in prisons, soft approach from officers, and also moderate prisoner mates discussion. To capture terrorists still persists in their radical beliefs, and one participant didn't state clearly whether she had left or still stay in the group. And when we look at the 6 release stories from group 1 and group 2 above. They group after the exposure of moderate materials, self-introspections, new supportive community, distancing from radical friends, and found that the reality was different from extremist propaganda. And these are the strategies usually applied by the terrorist recruiters by online platforms. The most strategies they use is to use the clickbait words like jihad or hijrah, and the spread of hoax articles and videos focusing on narrative of Muslim suffering atrocities. Once online, then individuals then directed to use fake names. This is all interesting because all of if we look at the members of any extremist groups, they always use fake names, and radical materials then spread out into the group. And to maintain their loyalty, online group administrators do not permit arguments between members. No, they only permit the questions, but no arguments are permitted. And every member of the group also restricted to look at other resources outside the group. And they will say that other Ustad or Muslim preachers outside the groups as infidels or heretics. And all of this strategy are aimed to increase group loyalty, solidarity, exclusivism, and ideologism. And this is the current conclusion of my research, that most current terrorist groups like ISIS and GAD are using the internet. And online radicalization contributes to a significant proportion of the radicalizations among Indonesians. But however, offline engagement are still very important. There are some opportunities for authorities to counter online radicalizations, like increasing or improving the online police patrol and improving digital literacy among societies. And the last conclusion is that even though online factors are important of the process radicalizations, when it comes to this engagement to the same individuals, face-to-face interactions and personal change of reflections, independent of online processes, matter. I think that is my presentation, and thank you.
That's excellent, Mukhamat. Thanks very much. That gives us plenty of time now for a discussion, which is good because we've got lots to unpack from both of you. Just a reminder to participants to post your questions in the Q&A section if you can. Julie, I'll start with you though. Could you come back to this question of pathways? And also if you have any reflections on Mukhamat's findings and how they sort of sit alongside what you've been doing with respect to this question of pathways, that would be really helpful. You've got the 2021 pandemic problem, Julie. You're on mute.
I actually have a question for Mukhamat.
Great. Excellent.
And that is, do you see online, in my work, I see there being 5 pathways and 1 partial pathway. Kinship, schools, study circles, conflict. Actually, let me back up. They can be divided into internal pathways and external pathways. So the internal pathways are kinship and schools, and the external pathways, acknowledging that study circles is the primary free space where everything happens. Study circles, conflict, prisons, and one partial pathway, which is online. And what I was very interested in knowing from you is, do you see online as being a distinct process and pathway of joining for Indonesians, or is it something where it's a tool that can lead people to join, and then they join in activities and then they get vetted in real time, or somebody joins study circles and then they segue into online to increase the radical sensibilities? Is it a full pathway, much like study circles, with iterated levels and levels and levels of studying? And first you study this, and then you study that, and you develop relationships with people out in your study circle, and they become your brothers. And then you go for more levels and more levels and more levels. And then after maybe 6 months or a year, or if you're JI, 4 years, you might become a member if you show due commitment and due time. Does that happen with online, or is online half pathway, half tool?
Yes, that is a tough question actually. Because yes, I'm one of your fans, Julia. I read of your journals and your books as well. So
terima kasih banyak.
Sama-sama. Well, when I look at the pathway of my participants, some of them they were poorly only used online methods, Julia, while others, the online media was just sort of a tool to, yes, of course, then to bring them go deeply into another step of tourism. And so some of them attended some Islamic study groups. But firstly, however, the first acknowledgement and they knowledge about the radical materialists they got from the internet. And nowadays Indonesian young, from my literature review, I found that more than half of Indonesian youth now use social media in the internet. And there are two popular platforms usually used. I don't know, I can name the platform here or not, but there are at least, yes, two social media platforms usually used to spread out the radical materials and to recruit new members. So
me too.
At least two, because by social media. Can I?
Yes, you mentioned that. I think it's fine to mention the platforms because discussion.
Okay. From my participant, I found that two platforms usually used. The first one is the Telegram, and the second one is the WhatsApp. These two platforms is the most popular platforms used in Indonesia to interact and to create new groups. Yeah, that's the difference with the YouTube or Instagram or any other social media. But when we join into any groups created by the extremist administrator, so then they applied the strategies. So the first one is the clickbait. They spread all the clickbaits on the internet. So whenever someone Googling or typing any words like jihad or hijrah on the internet, then they will be directed to join in more specific platforms. The first one is the WhatsApp, and the second one is the telegraph. That's what I got from my participants here.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Mukhamat. Does that fit with what you've been observing, Julie? Have you seen it?
I've seen that. I've also seen some with Facebook. What I thought he was actually,
Yes.
what I thought you were going to refer to was some more of the chats. So like Forum Albustro and Al Muktabal, et cetera, more of the smaller platforms. But yes, definitely Telegram, WhatsApp. There was a little with Pal Talk, but it never became as big.
So the recruiters, once they've got somebody's interest from clickbait or other material, steer them into an encrypted messaging platform where they can have a private conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But what my work found was that if they find somebody to be promising in any way, they try to get them in real time, to vet them in real time. People don't get it. It's kind of like Heghammer's article in 2013 on recruitment. It's too risky to simply recruit purely online. Even among the ISIS recruiters I spoke to, they're not going. It's never 100% online. They want to meet people.
And Mukhamat, fitting with that, I mean, I think your research has shown that the offline world is actually more important than the online world, right? The online world is a means to the end of the real world interactions. Yeah.
Mine as well.
Yeah. Question from Mia Bloom for we're starting with Mukhamat on the radicalization of women and children. And your sample has been people who have been charged or in the process of being charged, have come out of prison. There's not so many women and children in that space, but what are your observations? And maybe Julie, you have some observations as well. What are we seeing in both Indonesia and the Philippines with respect to women and children? Are we seeing a changing pattern? What's developing there?
What I found among the 4 women that I spoke to in Marawi who were radicalized into the Maut group, and among the Indonesian women, in a lot of cases, with the 4 that I spoke to in Marawi, you had that issue of redemption or feeling like you needed to, a lot of these women felt, I wouldn't even call it redemption, they felt like they needed to save their families. They felt like they needed to save themselves. There was a level of desperation that you didn't see with the men. Women whose family had lost their livelihood, father had lost the livelihood, so she gets this opportunity to be a recruiter. This is the way that her family, now reduced to eating river vegetables, can actually eat. They weren't keyed in, the women were not keyed in, the men weren't even keyed in to what was happening. They didn't know they were going to lay siege to Marawi. Even people who were given guns, they were told, do jihad and go to heaven. They were told only the most general things. Oh, come join this battle. They weren't told of the intent to burn Marawi. There was, again, that financial incentive, I think was very enticing for the 4 I spoke to. One needed an operation. One, the father had died. The mother had had a mental health crisis. They'd lost their home. Everyone had stories, one worse than the next. And you found that with the men too in Marawi, who had this redemptive aspect, but men had a more varied scenario. With women, at least the small number that I spoke to, you had that kind of crisis moment and deciding to do this. And it was a family crisis more so than a personal crisis. In Indonesia, I think Nava Naranya's article in the New York Times, but also in Terrorism and Political Violence, can really shed light on women in Indonesia, especially the case of Dian Yulianovi. And so I turned to that. She did excellent interviewing and excellent work with that case. I was never able to get permission from her to sit down and talk to her. But Nava did iterated interviews. And so that is who I turned to for that specific case. But you did have women who, like Dian, who were living abroad. They were migrant workers, often maids, and online did play some role for them in getting them connected to study circles. And online gave women a role that they didn't have leading roles before. Very recently, they didn't really have leading roles in any of these groups. Online gave them a way to hide their faces and their presence so they could be fundraisers, so they could run chat rooms, and they could take more assertive roles in these radical groups. And Dian was recruited by Bahram Naim to participate in terrorist attack.
Yeah.
But before her, there were no cases like that. And
Yeah.
I think that that's the interesting thing with Dian Yulianovi.
Yeah, really interesting case study, and reminds us of why the individual life story is so important, and speaking as individuals is so important. And Nava and of course Sydney Jones at IPAC have done really great work in answering these questions. But Mukhamat, before you took up your PhD candidature at UQ, you were head of the division for criminal psychology at the Indonesian National Police headquarters. So I'm sure you've spent a long time thinking about this question, apart from the PhD research interviews, about the role of women and children. What are you seeing?
Well, from these participants, I have 5 of women among participants, and what I see here is that there is no specific particular differences among women and men in the pathways. So in my opinion, so it is a more like a personal processes. So everybody could be terrorist, no matter how your education is, no matter your family background, your economic, and even your gender. So from my research, we can say that I couldn't find any differences between women and men in the case of terrorism, about the involvement. Yes, of course, in these reasons, terrorist organizations, more men than women involved, especially in the higher positions like the leader or the ideologues of the terrorist group, always men, and more men involved in the terrorist organizations. That's all I can say. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Mukhamat. As a psychologist, it's a reminder. I mean, for better and for worse, for better, of course, women have great agency in Indonesia. That also applies in this extremist space. They're not passive actors. There's a question about the online environment. We've just been discussing that the online environment is a means to an end. But the question is asking what more could be done in the online environment to prevent radicalization and recruitment. What's worked and what more do we need to be doing in that space?
That is one of my suggestions, that we have to improve the online police patrol, because as the technologies always develop from time to time, and the terrorist groups also they use the technology such as internet as a tool of for the movement. So the authorities should improve the capabilities as well, like doing more online police patrol, and also we have to provide a society to have a good literacy, digital literacy. That is also important, that we should not believe every material search from the internet. That's also important, because in the major society in Indonesia, we will be easily to be exposed with radical materials or any hoax videos, and without any cross-check to any other informations, or the government don't, if they don't do like counter the hoax, that will probably epoch the radical movement in the society.
And is that something that's gotten worse during this 2020, 2021 pandemic period, online hoaxes and conspiracy theory?
Well, I honestly, I don't do any specific works on that field yet.
Yeah. And you're with Indonesian National Police, which is part of the National Counterterrorism body, BNPT. What's being done in the online space there to prevent recruitment, radicalization, and try and make the space safer?
Yes, we have run the new regulations of the counterterrorism movement in Indonesia. We have conducted and we have improved the online detections among terrorists in Indonesia, honestly. When they spread out any clickbaits, let's say hijrah or jihad, then we also notice that words as a potentially used as the gate into the terrorist groups or movement. That we can do. And we also the new regulations will not only charge the people who actively joined and doing real work in joining the terrorist group, but we also can charge them with the plan of and participating in the terrorist movement. So we have more strong regulations in Indonesia, and more capable officers to do specifically in the online patrol. Thank you.
Julie, what are you seeing in the online space, and what do you think can be done, or what currently works in prevention and countering?
I'd have to say that I will defer to Mukhamat about that. That's a little out of my lane.
Yeah. Do you see though that the online space is being used as a way of forming relationships where people are drawn into networks?
I think that it is, what we've seen is the online space being used as a way to consolidate networks that already exist. So Bahram Naim used that for teaching bomb making to some members of Team Hispa, and he'd known about half of them ahead of forming that cell. But he knew them, he'd grown up with them. And then they chose people that they also knew. Bahram Naim, for those not familiar, was a terrorist recruiter who died in Syria. So I'm always of the mindset that online can be a tool. It is definitely a tool for ideology, for strengthening ideological predispositions. It's a tool for radicalization. It's a tool for forming connections. But I think for Indonesians, nothing beats face-to-face. And that's very different than American white nationalist extremists. That's very different than Europeans who went to join ISIS. It's very much, even if we look at people who claim that they were radicalized online, like that huge family who went to Syria, Danya and Noor and their whole family, I think more than 24 members of this family. The person who drove that was the uncle. He turned a significant portion of the family in Jakarta into a study group studying the works of ISIS cheerleader Aman Abdurrahman. He was in financial ruin. He was going through a multidimensional crisis. His wife needed surgery. He had 2 profoundly autistic children. And ISIS was the solution. They promised that family everything. They promised them that the kids would get the best care, that the wife would get treated by the best doctors in Mosul. And he could reclaim himself as a man who was not a complete failure. And then he was this linchpin in this family. And we can't ignore that, even though when we hear Danya tell the story, she, as a 15-year-old, convinced that whole family to follow her to Syria. And she was radicalized on the internet. I have no doubt she was radicalized on the internet. But without her uncle, none of that would have happened.
Yeah, that's
the thing we need to keep in mind. And that's what we get from doing iterated interviews.
Yeah, very good point, Julie. We need to speak to people, and people do like to tell their stories, don't they? So that it's so powerful, and well, particularly in Indonesia, one of the world's biggest Facebook communities, WhatsApp user communities, but it's the face-to-face friendship interactions that are so important. And thankfully, they're also keen to speak to researchers with due respect and care, so we can learn their stories, which you've been doing, Mukhamat. I imagine, Mukhamat, when you came to Brisbane, that I'm guessing that your response was, "Where is everyone? Why is it so quiet?" Yes. Indonesians are incredibly social, so it's not an either-or case between online and offline. It's very much both, isn't it?
Yes, true.
And I'm not belying the fact that we see this with Mia Bloom's research, that online is addictive, that you do form relationships online and they're significant and they're tangible. But in the experience, what I would say is that for Indonesians and for the Indonesian extremist groups, nothing beats the in-person interactions. And that is something that might make Indonesia unique. But it also, one thing that I think is fantastic about studying Indonesia is that, first of all, it's fairly low stakes for people to talk to you. Second of all, while you will get a surface analysis if you go once, if you go multiple times and you show that you care about people, you will get a fuller picture of their story over time as they come to trust you. But also that there's so many different groups in Indonesia. Over the course of a decade, I interviewed members of 14 different groups. And that enables us to do something extraordinary. We can hold ideology constant, because if you have a dozen groups with the same ideology, why pick one over another? Why pick that one, not that one? And that's something that is a really interesting thought experiment to work with.
That's really fascinating. We're of course out of time just when we're getting into the interesting discussion. But Mukhamat and Julia, hopefully we can have you back with other AVERT things face to face next year, inshallah.
I would love that.
But Zoom as
Inshallah.
well. And you know, Mukhamat, we mentioned your colleague, friend, PhD supervisor, Adrian Cherney. He's coming up after lunch. We're going to go now to a lunch break, a nice long lunch break, because it's day 3 and we've been working hard. Back at 1 o'clock, and Adrian's going to be talking about the case managed programs for rehabilitation CVE delivery in Australia. And we're going to go on to a conversation through the afternoon about what Australia is doing in the CVE space, building on this morning's discussion. But really nice to have had this chance to visit Indonesia on the way through, because you're right, Julia, there's so much rich material and it's relatively accessible. People are friendly, they want to talk. We can hear their stories. It's important that we do. Because it is very much about human interaction that drives, and even when we're talking about extremism, it's still very much a human story. Thank you to you both, and look forward to seeing you both again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And back at 1 o'clock after the lunch break, all. Thank you.
Yes.